I am going to get rolling. So welcome, everyone. I appreciate you coming in to what I advertised as a virtual book tour kickoff for my book, Closure After Stroke. It's always nice to have the prop. As you can see behind me, I have my emotional support elf buddy who joins me here when we need a little levity to some of these events. He was part of my Believe in Balance kickoff as well when I did my balance and fall prevention workshop. So I put this out to my entire community. So I have my primary community that I post most often here is on No Stroke Substack, but I also have Achieve Balance Substack that I'll mention at the very end. So what I think I'm going to do now as part of kind of introducing myself is I am going to make an attempt to share my screen, and I'm not going to go crazy with the full slide deck because I already, let me see if I can do this. It looks like I might be able to. And I just don't know if I can advance the slides, but that's okay. Let me just try one other thing. Okay, yes, I can do it right here. Beautiful. Okay. All right. So you're here today for a brief overview and my promise to you that I was going to reveal what's in my book, Closure After Stroke. And early in the week, I said this was the kickoff to my sort of first virtual book tour. It is here on Substack, but I actually did a big event earlier in the week with one of the stroke support groups that I presented at many times, Stroke Buddies, Ralph Preston's group, who is a stroke survivor and also has a chapter in the book. But so we already did a 90-minute session, used this deck, but I talked mostly around the focus on PFO because I'd already done a PFO 101 with this group a couple of months ago. And there were a lot of follow-up questions, and we did sort of a PFO 102. So I'm going to focus more on the content of the book because we didn't have a chance to get to that after Ralph's great session. Ran 90 minutes. This one, I'm going to start the clock now to keep myself honest. I'm going to run 20 to 30 minutes and only about 15 here, just going through the topics that I cover in the chapters in the book. So first, for those who, just coming in the first time, getting to know me, my name is Dave Dansereau. I've been a practicing physical therapist 26 years. 7 years before that, I was also a registered dietitian, sports nutritionist. So in the past, 30 some odd years, I've done it all in healthcare, really. And I'll just want to say, I have no disclosures. I want to talk about a little bit about my stroke and my purpose and my why behind finally writing this book. But first, the background to my book is very important to me and personal. That backdrop is sunrise on Bridgeton, Maine, on Long Lake. That represented the time like a crazy person, Columbus Day weekend up in Maine. I think the water was under like 40 degrees. And I decided to wake up to a cold plunge. And that was kind of like a reset. My family had just had been through a couple of really rough years with health challenges. And I had put this book down many times in manuscript. And that was the kind of the go point or the green light that I got with my family to say, it's time to put this on paper. So, and then the other part of it, the backdrop became part of the coloring of the book, as you can see. But also that's me running the Boston Marathon. And if you look up close on that blue shirt, that was another goal of mine, but that also has specific meaning because that turned out to be like the most horrible marathon in 2018 from a weather standpoint. If you look close in the book, and maybe if you get yourself a copy, eventually you'll see that there's actually raindrops on there. And my son, who's graphic, much better than I am at doing creative art, and he was able to merge those two together. So I am just going to say now that my mission in presenting sort of my story is not unique to what many people after they've had a health challenge do. My mission is, really, as you can see here, is to help people understand the lived experience of stroke. And what's important in my discovery in aftercare and advocacy is that we've come to the conclusion that really, if you've seen one stroke, you've seen one stroke. That's what makes it uniquely challenging, and it makes it unique in aftercare. But it's really the point of my book and leaving a playbook is to talk about this in terms of becoming sort of the master chef of your own recovery, to work with the ingredients you have, but to really try and mix in until something really works and you have a meal, you can make a meal to remember. So I don't have one recipe that can absolutely fix what challenge you might have in front of you right now. But I can tell you that if you do quit, you lose, and you miss out on all the flavors of life. So it really is something that I have to start with the disclaimer too, that, as much as I'm presenting my story, I am not passing along medical care. I can only tell you about the what worked for me, my lived experience, and from both the professional side as a practicing PT that was able to go back in a stroke, a fierce stroke advocate that's kind of now passing over the torch to the new trailblazers that I hope can help impact change. But just a quick background, and then I want to jump into the three questions, or the three chapters really of my book, that you can, maybe it will help you understand better if it's something that it might appeal to you in terms of diving in and buying a copy of the book and getting involved in some of the aftercare bonuses that I'm going to be presenting. So quickly, I already mentioned, I'm an experienced PT. Prior to my stroke, I've had multiple corporate health centers, innovative PT, private practice PT centers as well. And I've also added to, during the pandemic, I really got motivated by digital and the potential when people were cut out of care and things shut down, the potential for remote care and doing a lot using digital and technology to kind of connect people outside clinic walls, and to address some of the care shortages we're seeing throughout the country in rehab and the limitations by insurance. So I'm also a certified aging in place and age tech specialist. And that's kind of what's next for me when I do hand off the torch. But much of my work that I do today in clinical practice has been shaped as my lived experience. And I don't have any disclosures, particularly to this talk, other than, if you enjoy, sort of the presentation and you want to grab a copy of the book, it is out on Kindle and it will be out in the fall in print. I'm getting a lot of requests for that. So I think enough about that. I want to just, say every stroke survivor has a story and has a why. This certainly was mine and still is to this day. My kids were much younger when I had my stroke. That is not my wife in the middle. She took the picture. That's a snow person. But, my first stroke, the book kind of goes down that about on the left and puts it in terms of chapters. In hockey, I had my first TIA on the ice that was missed by a coach that didn't know the stroke warning signs. I went on later, always trying to figure out why these two events early on in my teens left me kind of really scared and afraid about what was going on inside my body. But I think seeing my kids on there reminds me, like, my motivation initially became, why I started writing. And my first sort of advocacy dive into that was just a blog called No Stroke. I talked about it in depth in the presentation earlier in the week that we're looking I think Ralph's going to get that presentation up on replay on YouTube if you missed it. But I'm also going to record the full deck today. I just want to, after this slide, just want to go through the 3 chapters quickly, or 4 if you consider overtime. But ultimately, not being able to explain stroke to my 3 young kids, and it was non-threatening and non-scary, and not having the resources, and going to the American Heart Stroke Association and trying to get advocacy and trying to get resources, and being turned down multiple times, and then being involved throughout most of my my time in stroke recovery has been spent in advocacy. But when you have a stroke with 3 kids under 7, you have a heart defect that no one knows what to do with, and that's why I say now, this became my superpower. Not maybe time for a different presentation, but I joke that to my kids, like that PFO occluder became sort of my Tony Stark arc reactor. Maybe we watched a little too much Avengers and a little too much Marvel during the pandemic. But what I wanted to just jump into is that having closure and finally feeling well again made me feel like it's time to give back. And it's when I let go of the anger in the early phases of recovery and turns it into positive things, that once I felt better, but my journey wasn't straightforward. I was in the early days of PFO closure. If anyone is jumping in for the first time and is hearing the term PFO, PFO stands for patent foramen ovale, and it's essentially a flap or a fold in the atrial septum of the heart. And in 3/4 of the population, it's meant to be there until you are born. So it's essentially there before you are born. But with the moment you are born, with your first breath outside of the womb, that flap or that hole is supposed to close. And about 1/4 of the population, and I was in that 25% or so, it doesn't completely seal, or it's left open. So patent foramen ovale is a Latin term. Patent means hole or opening. And then foramen is hole. So open, hole, ovale. I don't know why the ovale is oval. So it's like some people describe it as a tunnel or an oval, other people as a flap. But that's why I wrote an entire chapter in my book about it, because it was something that was foreign to me, someone that was in healthcare for, like I said, 6 years actually into practice when I woke up to a stroke. So the first chapters, the first period, as I put my story into periods, going back to my hockey roots, power play is my recall of my experience on the ice during that first TIA that went undiagnosed from a coach. Running and the importance of that, and always being challenged by running, and later finding out I was probably deoxygenated or decompensating the whole time I was training in my younger years. And then the foundation is attributed to my dad, and Keep the Faith, and his sort of his legacy. And my kids were young and never got to meet him before he passed. He died from a hemorrhagic stroke, but what really killed him was it was really from the after effects of 3 rounds of chemo. That cancer is really what took his life. And it's a tribute to what I wanted to share with my family about how in hard times having that foundation and those roots. And he was, as a military veteran and someone who was very much someone who measured just about everything, especially in his business. And he left me with the foundation in masonry as his craft to pass along and talk about, as I apply it to my story, the foundations and the fact that we're not measuring in stroke recovery. So we can't really manage if we're not measuring. So those chapters, and of course my Stroke Hero chapter, is a tribute to my wife and the caregivers. And if anyone's listening as a caregiver, they have the hardest lift in recovery, and it's my thank you to her as well. So in the second period, we moved to advocacy, and I did a lot of advocacy. I started out with my blog, later became part of the PFO, Patient-Led Research Foundation, ultimately ended up giving testimony before the FDA. I got involved with Teddy Bruschi and Teddy's team, prior to my stroke, I knew no one who had survived a stroke or who had got back to life uh, after a stroke from a cryptogenic, then PFO related stroke. And I found out Teddy Bruschi in New England here was the only other person. So he kind of mentored me. I kind of ended up becoming part of Teddy's team and supporting their mission. And Jamie Coyle and Bright Minds, another patient story. You're going to see about 6 or 8 patient stories woven into the book. There's 2 right there in the first chapter. My work, the American Heart and Stroke Association, the former National Stroke Association, I was a mobility column writer for them. They ultimately had to close, which just talks about a lot of the barriers to maintaining all these great stroke support organizations and self-funding. Ralph Preston, who I mentioned earlier, I spoke to his group live earlier in the week at Stroke Buddies. He's in the book. The Slinky effect and physical therapy crisis is really important to bring up because at discharge, when we don't support patients longitudinally with the right services, we have this recoil or this, it's different than the plateau and such that we often discharge saying the patient has reached a plateau. And if you've been part of our, almost 100 episodes of our No Stroke podcast, you realize that that's not true. We know the science now, and I'll talk briefly in recovery about what the science says about longevity and neuroplasticity. But we are also facing a PT crisis, and I dive into that in my book because I see it from both sides. I'm a practitioner of 26 years, but I also see PTs that are leaving the profession after getting a DPT and being in debt, some over $150,000. They cannot keep up with the burden and the ongoing cuts. So we aren't going to have, we're not going to have skilled providers in the next 10 years if we don't, if someone doesn't sound the alarm there. So I am. I talk about the patient voice. I mentioned my testimony before the FDA. Some of these chapters were released early before the book, so you can actually search for them now on No Stroke. Then I move into the high incidence and young stroke and the work of the SIA consortium that I'm involved in with my patient voice. And SIA stands for Stroke in Young Adults, and that's a consortium led by my neurologist up at Tufts here in Boston. And finally, I do talk about the stigma of stroke. It took kind of me, I covered this up for many years. It took, interviewing some great guests to kind of lift the burden and reveal a few things that I never told anyone about. And I did some of them the first time on the podcast live and then recount in the book. And one of those important episodes was Senator Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico, who also had a stroke. So I invite you to learn more about his story in the book. Third chapter is really all about recovery, and it focuses on education and really the evidence-based science in stroke recovery. So, I talk about what worked in my playbook. Again, going back to the beginning, if you've seen one stroke, you've seen one stroke. So your framework, your recovery blueprint is different for everyone, but there are certain pillars that I think we're not adequately addressing. And I think when I started by telling you briefly my why, but as a treating PT now, I treat entirely differently now that I'm back to practice as a stroke survivor with that lived experience. But I always start with wanting to know a patient's why. Why do they come to recovery? Whether it's after a stroke or a neurological progressive disorder that may have poor prognosis, or whether it's just a simple knee injury or orthopedic injury. I always start with what's the patient's why. And I wrote an entire book around sort of onboarding patients based on my experience and finding their why. And I actually wrote an entire course off of this book that you'll hear more briefly about at the end. But I go through successful stories of people sharing their why. Carolyn Goggin, who is the voice of the No Stroke podcast, has been on our show several times. She, again, is the intro jingle, but she also has a powerful story of her why in connection, and originally asking the question after her stroke, going home with a cryptogenic stroke, like, why me? And then changing that narrative by changing her mindset in terms of saying, now I'm glad it was me, because it made her have a whole new appreciation for life. So I encourage you to dive in to her story as well in the book. My why had to do with going back to the hardest thing that I'd ever done prior to my stroke. That's why I stuck that picture on the front cover. But that cover is not my first Boston Marathon. What's important about that cover is I ran with a team on my first marathon with Teddy's team. And on my second, I was addressing some of those late effects of my stroke in terms of mental health. And I decided I was going to go to the Boston Marathon alone. Every time I would go back to the well, I wasn't really addressing my mental health. I turned to running, and good and bad, it helped me get to where I am today. But in that 2018 photo, turning on Boylston Street, it was very meaningful for other reasons, because the person who took that shot just happened to capture. It had been raining from before the race, and Hopkinton, the athletes' village, was flooded through the entire race. And it was a 30, just below freezing driving rain for literally over 5 hours, what it took me to finish. But when I turned that corner and saw the finish line, and then shortly after that, I saw my two sisters, who were my rocks too, along with my wife, had just made it to the gate. And with all the security after the bombings in Boston, it's hard to get to the finish line. Well, they just made it out of pure luck, or maybe it was purpose, maybe higher power, my sister will tell me when she saw that I put that on the cover, she goes, I still will always remember that shot that you did the gun show, because I from just absolute horror for 5+ hours, my worst timed marathon, but my biggest victory. And that's why at the beginning, it was so important to put that on. But also, Boston was where I had all my care for like 9 months. And I talk about in the book back and forth to Boston, to finally bring closure to closure. So then I talk about neuroplasticity. Legs feed the wolves, a hockey reference. You're going to have to get the book to learn more. But my patients hear me say that all the time. Music and rhythm were I'm handling the brain like a football, and I apologize. I'm kind of amped up on a Friday here. But music is medicine. You're going to dive into that chapter on neuroplasticity and music. Your muscles and sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is the age-adjusted loss of lean muscle mass. It's something we don't talk about enough in stroke when we send people home without the tools to keep. Your muscle is your biggest organ that can improve your long-term health outcomes, especially after stroke. And unfortunately, when we don't support stroke survivors early enough, often enough, and long enough, we fall victim to early loss of lean muscle mass, which that functional decline that comes with it. There's so many reasons why your muscle is just not inert tissue. It's metabolically active. It relates to every health system in your body, and we're just not talking about it. So I talk about Believe in Balance again. I have an entire course through Achieve Balance that I'm weaving into the aftercare resources, or the bonuses in the book. As simple as you give my book a like and a share, and this is a course that I currently charge for on Achieve Balance, but Achieve Balance Substack. But I'll leave that gateway open for free for anyone who buys the book, and I'll talk about why that will also support a cause on the back end. But nutrition is something that is absolutely non-existent in most stroke survivors' discharge plan of care. As a PT who wrote a book on it, but also saw the power of that in some of my early clinical practice and research, how we shape behaviors by improving nutrition, open the gateway to maybe stopping smoking and being more physically active. Again, there's an entire course that I wrote based on the book that I'll talk more about, maybe in the next, maybe it's in the next virtual book tour part 2, if you will. But I talk about the power of my own home stroke recovery, and a lot of the tech and tools I brought into the home. Remember, I had 3 kids under 7, family health issues, and I was not. I needed to bring rehab home. I needed first to be with my kids, so to free up, my wife's ability. You still have to have income. People still have to work. Life doesn't stop when you've had a stroke, and unfortunately, the heavy lifting has to come from the folks that we love the most and our caregivers. So, there's a lot of tips I have to offer on home stroke recovery. Rory Polera comes into the picture as someone who really is using home tools and technology. He's a trailblazer in this area. He writes on Substack. You're going to meet him in the book. And finally, in the third part to this, it's very important that I included exercise guidelines specific to PFO, closure and non-closure. I was sent home after they finally came up with my PFO diagnosis. I was sent home with no guidelines. I was told, don't lift more than 8 pounds. A 3-year-old that wants to be picked up was off the table all of a sudden. That became my motivation to make, quality of life decisions. And we fought for 9 months to finally be able to get PFO closure. That path to closure and those options are improved now. They're not fantastic, but it's in part by a lot of the heavy lifting of patient-led groups and support groups like that I helped found at the PFO Research Foundation, that now we know more about screening and PFO, guidelines. But still, on my blog, going back 15 plus years, one of the chapters that gets the most traffic, even to this day, was just a blog post called PFO Exercise Guidelines, and like why we don't have them. And still to this day, it gets over 100 hits, and I haven't touched that page forever. Maybe I'll put my book post back up now that I'm able to contribute to the guidelines. But it's one of the most frustrating things for people that come off a PFO closure that are, go home with one of these things. Sorry, if Abbott wants to send me a true one, I wouldn't have to use my prop. But the guidelines are all over the place. They're from, you can have it closed and you can go and walk and start running 2 days later, to no, you can't do anything for 6 months. So what is that? Where does that leave the patient? So we still need to do better there. But I gave a framework of guidelines in the book that you can bring to your own provider as well. And then finally, after FDA testimony, I thought my journey was over. But I was still dealing with some of those late effects of stroke and the mental health game. And then I ran into Mike Yarrow, who I liked what he was doing over in the UK. He later came back to the States, but that's what got us to team up. We ultimately when I go through the full deck, I'm not going to do it today. I talk about Enable Us and a lot of the doors that were closed. We were trying to build a digital health platform that brought in a lot of the shortcomings I talk about in advocacy. But unfortunately, we got kind of caught up in the pandemic and couldn't find a customer, as you could say. So we pivoted and we turned to the No Stroke podcast, and now, 100 episodes in, we're going to be sunsetting that. It's time to leave that to whoever feels that they want to continue to to build on that library, share that library. But I talk about that in my open letter, in my endgame and final notes in the book, which I think will hopefully find somewhat revealing. And I heard someone mention on a comment my open letter to Nancy Brown of the American Heart Stroke Association. The person referred to it as very provocative. Well, it's factual and it's true. And when I surveyed some 25 stroke support organizations, many who I've actually presented to over the years and learned all the shortcomings and the blind spots and not being supported at levels above, that's why I had to write about it. And I sent that open letter by mail and by email. They have received it and they're coming back with a response. So, and the most, I'm going to leave you another cliffhanger. There's a really interesting bonus that I want all those stroke communities to talk about as I build a scenario for building community with the example of the history of spike ball. So you can look it up yourself, but but it's a real interesting story how they built an entire community around a net and 4 walls. And there's a lot of people that connected with me after I put out the open letter and said, good for you, that you're saying what needs to be said. They talked about how they want to do something aside or new to the American Heart and Stroke Association, to do something better, I'll put it bluntly. And so that's my challenge in reading the bonus is, what you might learn from when I hand off the playbook to what I feel can be done better. So, for me, it's a lot. It's like the long story of Forrest Gump and running. I've been doing a lot of running. I'm tired. My advocacy journey is essentially, I look at it as wrapping it up. Going into the fall, we're going to be finishing our episodes of the podcast. What happens next with those? I hope they go into, learning libraries that can improve stroke care. We've interviewed thought leaders, we've interviewed researchers, we've interviewed clinicians, we've interviewed stroke survivors and care partners from all over the world. There's really not anyone else we can interview to point to the fact that we need to do better. So our advocacy, for my part of it anyway, I'm starting to move on to new things, and some of it's going to be on the back end in supporting the book and a lot of the care gaps that I feel that I can contribute to with my background in physical therapy as I bring closure to stroke. So I'm gonna come off the screen, but I just want to show you when I record the rest of the deck, or when I get the link to Ralph's presentation, because like Forrest Gump here, I am tired. That presentation earlier the week went 90 minutes and we still didn't get to all the questions. So on No Stroke Substack, you'll see I did about a 20-minute video answering the questions that I didn't get to. But, when I talk and educate, these are sort of the slides that I dive deeper into. Like there's this major blind spot that we're primary and secondary prevention. If there's good news in stroke, it's that 80% of strokes are preventable, but we're not treating upstream. And I go through the slides and say, like, just in terms of stroke awareness, there's so many people that just don't even know what a stroke is still. 70% of the US population cannot identify more than 2 of the stroke warning signs in 2026. That is just crazy. I'm not going to cover here, but that's the exact spot in that top left-hand corner. I can tell you exactly where I had my first TIA, like it happened yesterday. I talk about my second stroke. I dive deep into all this in the book. We went over early in the week the paradox around PFO closure, and again, the most important thing to me and directed some of my care is I always remember what my son said: when you feel better, can you pick me up? So I do dive in on the replay too about the closure procedures. This has 2 full chapters in my book, so I'm not going to cover it here. I did do PFO testimony, which I talk about, and you can actually, Respect for Stroke is the name of that post. It's actually live on Substack if you want to hear me talking through it. So I had to tell my story in all of 3 minutes. And when I go and I do my presentation I don't know if it's going to show here, but I dive deep into the brain and what caused my stroke and the late effects from my stroke, the deficits I have. But in writing this book, my goal isn't to talk about my deficits, it's to talk about sort of the tip of the iceberg for many stroke survivors and empower, like how we discharge people, maybe getting them up on their feet and giving them better balance. But then we don't talk about all these things under the iceberg. So that's what I dive into in my book. I talk about the high-tech tools and I say high-tech or high-touch. A lot of the tools that we have at Spalding Rehab and Shirley Ryan, they're only available if you qualify to be in sort of the best rehab center in the country. For most community rehab centers that they go to, you might have a mat and a table, and you might have a willing therapist who may or may not be neuro-trained. But I think we can do so much more, and that's why I think moving care into the home is really where the puck is headed in rehab. But we have to work together and build a connected marketplace to be able to do that. And that's what I try to address in the book. That's me in the back. That simple video I did after a goal setting webinar years ago was me talking about how I created a gait and fall prevention harness system, because even as a clinic owner who had to close their practice, I didn't have in my clinic at the time a $10,000 gait right system to help people. But that's exactly what I needed to get my gait back and get my sequencing back, along with music and rhythm. So in the day, I talk on the screen about sort of the things that I gamified. I did a lot of Wii Fit with my kids. The swing set became my balance trainer as I pushed my 3-year-old. Couldn't pick him up, but I could have my daughter help him get in, and I could practice my balance pushing him. So I had very aggressive goals that ultimately led me to get back to the Boston Marathon. But I also had a team. Teddy Bruschi and Teddy's team became that team. Again, my goal is not to go through these slides, but maybe just to tease you that this was, the night before the very first Boston Marathon I ran. And I talk about crossing was priceless, but there were a lot of things that were still unresolved, including a lot of the advocacy barriers, which made me, realize it's time to rethink stroke care. So I write about it on No Stroke. It's in the book. I talk about, 3 attempts to try to get early intervention for kids' stroke awareness that were declined 3 times by the American Heart Stroke Association. Talk about our lessons learned from not being able to fund Enable Us, as I mentioned, due to the pandemic. I talk about how expensive it is to get into the International Stroke Conference as a survivor-led voice. That is a picture of me the last time in 2020 was the last time I was able to get in, only because we had a micro grant from the university. Otherwise, it would have cost over $1,600 to attend those sessions. So tell me how a patient can have a seat at the table when we don't have a forum. And I could go to and I mentioned in my book, I could go for $50 to a European patient-led conference in Prague for less, and travel and everything for less than I could go to ISC and this year, like many, was in LA. I talk about a TheraCycle project, a patient-led initiative, and others that are in the book. I'm not gonna go into depth here, but only to say that lacking patient voice in research is stifling innovation. And that's another reason why we need to have a seat at the table. So I can see there's a little delay in the presentation. I think the final takeaways, because I did promise about 30 minutes and I know I'm running over here, is to swim upstream. We need to treat primary and secondary prevention earlier. That's why I try to work with bright minds and getting the attention of the national bodies to read about it in the book. Nothing happens till something moves is a quote by Albert Einstein, but it's so true in stroke rehab, especially. Your lifeline is movement and mobility. Exercise is always your best medicine, but especially in stroke, it's your lifeline. And if you see something broken, try to fix it. That's a message my dad always said. And I said there's a lot of aftercare, broken pieces in stroke that I think we still have the power to put together. If you want to learn more about the book launch bonuses, I'm going to come off screen, but I do want to tell you, follow me over on Substack. I mentioned the Believe in Balance program and pathway and workshop, which is live, is a good screening tool to start with. So stay up to date there. But also the thing with bringing closure to this is 20 years plus in survivorship and care and clinical practice. There were chapters I just simply had to cut. The book is already in digital, over 300, but it's in print. My author's copy, it's in the high 200s, like close to 3. So what you won't find in the book is a lot of the after, chapters. And just to give you some examples of ones it was hard for me. That's my dog Sully, our dog Sully. I use this as an example just to be kind of coy, is that, pets in recovery and mental health and therapy were a big part of my recovery. Writing was a big part of my recovery. I'm mentioning these like hacking recovery, the late effects or the misdiagnoses in addition to the late effects were things that sort of still bother me to this day, but I talk about taking the high road and looking at things we can change and not diving too deep into the past. So those bonuses are going to come when you buy a book, and I will be turning on a member component to No Stroke. It's completely free now, but the reason I'm going to bring the book into audio first via that. So if someone buys the book but then wants the audio version too, you'll be able to all you need to do is just write a review. If we're gonna grow this and then you get access to the bonus modules that I'm doing over on Substack. So more about that later. That's the Believe in Balance course. So join me over on Substack. I talk about the Stroke Support Organization survey already. Join me also with my co-host on the No Stroke podcast. It's on all platforms now. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it, because I've been going on for a long time, but I'm hopefully going to, I think I stopped sharing. Yes, I did. Let me jump back to the full screen. Yes, so I can see if there are any questions in the chat. I don't think so. If anyone has anything that comes through later, I apologize if nothing's coming in. But just pricing on the book. I'm seeing, hold on. Looks like Mark. There is a delay here, guys, too. I know I ran long. Mark, did you have a question? I know you were in Ralph's session earlier. You had some great comments about the connection with PFO and migraine, etc. Hold on. All right, I'm holding on, Mark. While I'm holding on, just pricing in the book. Book's out now on Kindle. You can get it today. I'll replay to this. I'll leave the link, but it's also pretty well posted on my No Stroke. It's $9.99 for the Kindle book. Are you interested in doing presentations like this, Stroke Awareness Oregon? Yeah, absolutely, Mark. That's a really great question. Thank you for that, Mark. Here's sort of the rollout. I'm doing these virtuals now. Obviously, Mark, you're familiar. You joined us over on Stroke Buddies. I want to pay it forward. I want to pay it back. A lot of the proceeds from my book, I've been quietly doing this. Ralph did bring it up. I've been able to these are not huge donations, but some of the proceeds from the book and the aftercare part of the resources, like the Balance program and the Achieve Balance course, I want to bring to survivor groups who that's their number one, Mark. And I'm very familiar with the work of SAO, Stroke Awareness Oregon. We've been in touch. Others who I presented with over the years I always leave the conversation saying they want more professional guidance, they want more engagement, they want more presentations. The pandemic caused a lot of these groups to move to Zoom, which improved access, because now you can attend a meeting, whether it's in South Carolina, in Oregon, in Rhode Island. But a lot of the impact, and we stay siloed. I'm trying to figure out a way that we can unite forces, and that's my chapter on Spikeball, honestly. But yes, I'm definitely, timeline on that is just the issue, Mark. I'm taking a couple of weeks off in August, but I am going to be doing early release print copies in additional to digital. The survivor groups that filled out my stroke support survey are already getting digital copies. Any stroke survivor that shared their story in the books getting the print copy first. Even though I set a September deadline, or 28th of September for the print, it's going to be out a little earlier. In fact, it's going to be out in a couple of weeks. So those groups get the book first. And then my goal, Mark, to answer your question in a long way, is that I want them to use that as a resource and playbook. And when they have me back on, I want to be able to direct, whether it's the program, the Balance program, I want to be able to direct those resources to them and offer more to these groups if they want to do, friendly competitions. There's a lot of ideas that I have, but I want to unite the stroke support community. So, I had a lot of power and I'm kind of running out of energy. But I feel like in bringing closure, yes, Mark, I want to do more for the stroke survivor communities. That's really in part one of the third reasons why I wrote this book. And building, selling some books and selling some courses and giving survivors access to those resources. I'll just leave you with one point to illustrate the point, and I hope that answered your question, Mark. But in 2018, and I read about this in my book. In 2018, the American Heart Stroke Association, their rehabilitation guidelines, they update probably every 3 or 4 years. They identified in 2016, actually, that falls were higher than the general public. Fall risk is a big thing, especially in stroke with any type of impairment in mobility. They made a guidance document statement that we as a entity in the stroke world should be including more balance in fall prevention training programs, but they don't take it to the next step, and they do a great job with the guidelines at in the early stages, and early supportive discharge, meaning, or door to needle time, but when folks do go home and they have these late effects or they have these impairments, they leave it up to the poorly funded and supported stroke support organizations to do the heavy lifting after formal therapy and outpatient. You go through the transitions of care. So I think the key is to unite those groups and demand and advocate for better and more unified services, so that it's not people like me. Thank you, Mark. I hope that does answer your question. But it's not left for individuals to try to carry the heavy lift of the torch. So I think that's all for now. I really appreciate the questions, and this will be out on replay. If Ralph doesn't have the full deck of the replay of the presentation I done in time, when I go to link this to the replay, I'll make sure I get it out via the chat or just a post or a note here. No stroke. But yes, hopefully you'll be learning more about what's planned after the book as I come up for air. But right now, I'm going to take the rest of this beautiful Friday afternoon off. And I thank everyone for staying on. I know I said 30 minutes and I ran long, so I am closing it out. So thank everyone. Look for the replay. Hopefully, if these are helpful, and I'll be doing more of them, maybe breaking down individual chapters, and we can kind of, talk about whether or not they would help individual stroke support groups to learn about the messages within each chapter. So thanks all. Appreciate it. And happy Friday. Until next time, stay well, keep the faith, keep moving forward.